So let me just start off with a few vignettes, really. If you've been in London recently, you might have seen the fire brigade going around the city, and you'd think, I think intrinsically we'd all think that, of course, a fire engine is a state actor, it's a state body, it's a fire engine, it's the fire service, the London Fire Brigade. But actually these fire engines, you find out when you do a bit of research, are owned by companies like ASSETCO. London's fire engines are actually owned indirectly by Lloyds Bank, which makes you start to think a little bit, why are they owned by Lloyds Bank? And in fact, under a 20-year contract, companies like ASSETCO, a company that has recently emerged in the global economy to take advantage of these welfare contracts to run things like fire engines and other things, are actually running these things. Now, ASSETCO are quite interesting because, ASSETCO are quite interesting because they actually are a company who are an asset company. They bought London's fire engines under a contract. They went bust. There was a huge argument in the French courts, therefore, about whether London's fire engines should be sold to pay off the debts of the company that had bought the contract to run the fire engines for the state. And this is an extraordinary story. So it's got me quite interested in some of I live in London, and I was actually interested in the fact that the fire engines, which are not being sold, there was a clause somewhere in a contract that said they were ultimately public assets eventually in the event of crisis. So they would stay in the public sector. But it was interesting that that was even raised. And it makes you think intrinsically, not only as a researcher, but as a citizen, what is there around you? And then you move on to using my local train service, which is run, you find out after you've done a bit of research, by Deutsche Bahn and SNCF. So every time I pay my extortionate train fare in London, they're the highest train fares in Europe, a lot of that profit goes directly to French companies, German companies. You may know that Abellio, the Dutch railways, has set up a fantastically successful company that now runs train and bus services all over the world. There are many in England. You may have been in London and you'll see the Dutch train services logo on buses, because you're making profit out of the London buses by running the contracts. If we just move on a little bit, I'll come to the reason why I think this is important in a minute. You begin to realise that in the case of London, when people start talking about things like localisation, community empowerment, and so on, the thing they miss out on is who owns the assets over which you're discussing. We think intrinsically that politicians own the things that we argue about, the hospitals, the schools, the roads, the infrastructure. We want to change them. Politics is all about changing those infrastructures, arguing with politicians about different visions. The problem is that when you start to think about localism in the case of where I live in southeast London, you see that the trains we just saw a minute ago are run by international companies under long-term contracts. The fire engines are owned by companies like ASSETCO that's now sold it on because they've gone bust. The streetlights where I live are not owned by the state. They're owned by Skanska, the North American Scandinavian conglomerate. They own the streetlights in London. They own them under a 25-year contract. They run and maintain them, put them in and service them. And if we move on a little bit in southeast London, the motorway, some of you have used the road from Road to Hell, the M25 orbital motorway around London. This is now run by French companies like Aegis and others who actually own they have a 30-year contract to manage and run this road. You begin to then think, well, just move on a little bit, please. The next one. So Aegis run, if you look at companies like Aegis, we're going to come back to how the private sector is changing later in the talk. But there are these new companies then that have emerged to grab hold of these welfare contracts. Some people like Richard Murphy argue that the world's biggest business opportunity is not in anything that we normally think about, like green economy or the environment. It is in capturing government welfare programs. That is where the money is. Right, so we have an amazing private sector, really, which is changing and reforming and turning into something else. It's turning into a dependent sector, which buys up welfare contracts. Welfare contracts have become where the money is. In the case of the British welfare state, for example, if we move on a little bit, companies like Circo, you may have heard about, run prisons, they run hospitals, they run projects in schools, they run school meals. These companies, I think, under the radar of us as researchers quite often, have emerged to take over whole parts of how welfare states are run, operated and governed. And yet when we talk about governance, where do they fit into our thinking? Where do they fit into my lectures to students about governing cities? If we're thinking about governing diversity, how do you govern diversity in a context where increasingly there is no such thing as a state in the way that we've thought about? We now see a very different form of state. We have to engage with actors like Circo, who have become super conglomerates, super powerful companies, who sometimes will dictate what can be done. We just move on to the next slide. There's an interesting report published by the Dutch Senate, by the way. I thought I'd put this in, not that it was part of my research, but There's an international agenda here. So across the European Union, other countries are looking at Britain and the way in which it's broken up, compartmentalised and sold off many aspects of its welfare as a role model, as a template for how you can bring about new forms of public-private partnership and private finance. And the Dutch Senate, in this article, you might want to look it up online, that came out last year, were looking at the potential benefits for the Dutch state for breaking open what you do here and selling it off to American companies. For example, there's an obvious logic. One of the things I'm going to talk about here and talk about in the book is that there is a real logic to this. It's not an illogical set of policies. There's a logic. And that logic is something we have to understand and engage with, I think, if we want to bring about political change. The logic being rolled out here, of course, is that what we can do is to use private expertise to make welfare systems work better. Why not, for example, take the University of Utrecht, put it under a contract, sell that contract to an expert American multinational or a company like Circo. It would come in, it would run the university under a contract, and it would bring about big reforms to make it more efficient very, very quickly, I suspect. And so for policymakers, what you find is that this is a very attractive option in terms of governance. It's a way also of beginning to distance yourself from quite controversial areas of government policy. But as we'll see, the problem with this model is it's spread so far that actually the key areas of government policy, including health and education, are now really almost subject to this privatisation. And it makes planning for cities incredibly hard to bring about. Let's move on to the final slide. It's the final little vignette, which is that in London, many of the issues I'm going to talk about here have come to a head recently. London's hospitals have been the recipients, I won't use the word victim, they've been the recipients of enormous private finance projects, which have left some of them bankrupt. So London's public hospitals, the same South London, where I live, are technically bankrupt agencies at the moment. And what's being done is that because there are enormous repayments to be made to private investors under these privatisation contracts, those are the last things to be stopped. The only way in which those cuts, the only ways in which those debts can be dealt with is, of course, through cuts. And so what we're seeing in London is that as spending on health still goes up, there are bigger and bigger cuts within hospitals to pay off private finance. So an extraordinary situation. And in South East London, there have been some huge protests recently where I live, Save Lewisham Hospital and so on, because cuts that seem to be being brought in for reasons of medical managerialism, actually when you look at it under the surface, it's all about paying off private debt for the next 25 to 30 to 40 to up to 60 years in the case of some contracts. So what I want to talk about then specifically, I'll come to the detail now, is some key points, I think. So move on to firstly, the importance of governing cities, an obvious point you might think, but one I think that is underplayed, because I think we have to understand how governance really works. And when we hear facile things like, we need to empower communities to take more control of their lives. Okay, but let's do a little thought experiment about where I live. How do I do that when I can't even tell the local authority how the streetlights have changed, because under a 30-year, 25-year contract, that's already been decided and set in stone? How do you change your hospital when the hospital is under a 30-year contract? 2049, my local hospital will be owned by a group of international investors who do not have to change anything because they signed the contract in 2003, and that contract set in condition in stone what would be done until 2049. You can't change it. So it's all very well telling me that it's my fault for not being an active citizen, not being empowered, not going out there and taking on. In fact, the reality is that the structures of governance around us have changed so much that it makes it almost impossible to take ownership, because ownership has been diverse, but diluted. I used to keep using the word diverse, it's coming back to us, has been diluted and reshaped. So I'm interested in the distribution of power within this, of course. I'm going to talk a little bit about there's a logic to this, and that's what I wanted to focus on first, more intellectually, about what the logic of this stuff is. A bit about the good governance agenda, because a lot of this comes from international bodies like the UN, the World Bank, the European Union and others, who push a good governance agenda now onto countries, not just countries in the global south. As we'll see, countries in the global north also respond to this agenda. But I'm going to argue that this is a real problem. Actually, it's a major problem. Even though it seems to be something which is very obvious and normal and good, it is actually a major problem. How do you build kind of smart or intelligent cities in a period of austerity politics is also important. Because, of course, one of the outcomes of many of these discussions is that these kinds of models of privatisation are an obvious way in which austerity governance will be delivered. If you think about places like Greece and other parts of southern Europe, there's been a big push to privatise in the name of austerity. So many of the things we're talking about here are going to become more important and more significant, much more significant, I think, across the EU. So the rise of privatisation is important in terms of the changing character of decision-making. Can we move on? Now, actually, I've got interested in a number of things in trying to explain some of these things more conceptually, and I just want to share some of these writings with you and just get your view on them actually afterwards in terms of whether you think this actually holds up. Because the thing is, there are many different ways in which you can interpret what we're seeing going on. What I'd like to do is begin by just talking through some of these intellectual agendas. I'll then focus specifically at the end on a couple of examples from London of social housing projects and hospitals, just to illustrate some of the bigger points that I'm making over the next 10, 15 minutes. But I think there's some great literature in political science that geographers and urban studies and planning people have not perhaps engaged with as much as they should have done, which really challenges what people like Braithwaite call the neoliberal paradox. Ever since I was a PhD student, I've always felt there's a paradox between people coming along to conferences like Neil Brenner and others saying, we're seeing state deregulation under neoliberalism. We're seeing a withdrawal of the state from everyday life. This is what neoliberalism is about. They argue that the state's doing different things. Policing, law and order and so on, of course, is still important. But there's an argument nonetheless, and a kind of intrinsic bias in much of the reading and writing that we hear, that the states are doing less. They're getting out of the way. They're becoming neoliberalised. Now, why is it then that governments still, even with austerity, spend more money than they've ever spent in the history of societies? Even in the case of Britain, that has undergone some austerity in the last 2 or 3 years, public spending will be something like $1 trillion worth of money next year. That's a lot of money for a neoliberal, withdrawing, deregulating government to be spending. Why is it that governments then across Europe spend more now than they've ever spent, even though we've been for 25, 30 years in a period of neoliberalism? It's an interesting paradox, I think. And some of John Braithwaite's work, I think, is fascinating in respect to this. And what these authors argue is that to explain this, we have to talk about not neoliberalism, but maybe the rise of something called regulatory capitalism. Which, basically what this argument is that under neoliberalism, the paradox is that while the state was running fewer things, it was regulating more of them and spending ever higher proportions of its budget on regulation. This is what Levi IV, whose writing I think is fantastic, yet I've never seen it cited in a geography conference or anything, talk about in terms of the rise of a regulatory capitalist system, where states are regulated by private sector, and the private sector regulates and performs the activities of states. What I was trying to say at the beginning was that what we have, increasingly, is that business interests have realised that the big money is to be found in running government programmes and projects. As they've done that, they've expanded their expertise into those areas. They run urban development projects, they run planning systems. In England now, planning even is becoming privatised, with private planning companies and consultancies becoming the planners rather than local authority planners. That's where all the money is. Now, the problem with that is it costs a lot of money to do that. It is not an option, which seems to be an option which is about privatisation and then giving things up and making things cheaper. But in fact, it's a form of new expense, of new cost. Cost means profit as well for private companies. Okay, so there's an argument here about whether this is a costly or non-costly system, but the argument by Levi IV and others is that it's a new form of capitalism. Okay, that businesses then also want more government spending and more regulation because they will benefit from that regulation by delivering it and managing it. So again, intrinsically, we think businesses we want less government, less tax, less regulation. Utter nonsense. Businesses, for example, in the case of urban development projects like the London Olympics, were the ones, of course, who took the £13 billion on offer for the London Olympics. They wanted a big Olympics. They wanted the government to spend more money. They wanted more government regulation to make it more complicated, to make it more expensive. Now, I think there's a real change here, because every conference I go to, I hear geographers casually talking about how businesses want deregulation. They want the state to get out of the way. That's actually not... Some businesses, yes, of course, but many businesses have a vested interest in more regulation, more government, more complexity. I think this is a real paradox. People like Claire Cutler, some of her writing on the way the security industry works across the world, on private international regimes, is fantastic. And if you're interested in any of these issues, I recommend that you follow up some of Claire Cutler's writing. It is really powerful. It's very persuasive. The relationships between government and the security industry helps to shape government policy. There was some interesting discussion I heard at a conference where people were talking about prisons, for example. If you give private companies contracts to run prisons, as you do in the US and increasingly in Britain, is it possible, and it's just put up as a question, I don't know if there's any evidence for it, but is it possible then that it might be in the interest of certain people for there to be more prisoners? Might that have an impact then on government policy towards prisoners? Maybe. And there's no evidence for that. I mean, there's some people writing in the US, I'm sure I don't know if it would know more than me, and some of you may know more. But you start to get different logics of government. If it's in people's interests, I thought it was quite ironic that the terrible murderer in the US recently who committed suicide, the guy in Ohio, just think about that. If a private prison was looking after that person for the whole of his life, that private prison would make a huge amount of money out of that prisoner. They lost an asset in that guy. I mean, I'm being deliberately mischievous. But there is money to be made from what the state does. And once you start bringing that in as a principle of governance, you change some of the dynamics of governance. Perhaps you need to go to war because there's money to be spent, etc., etc. That's some of the arguments of Cutler and others. I think more broadly, though, there are political changes that underpin this. It's not just about some of those bigger arguments. So for governments, people like, people like Scharf and others argue that there are other changes going on. So governments have become increasingly interested in what is called, what Scharf called, output legitimacy of projects. So people like Scharf argue that there's a distinction to be made between the input legitimacy, which most of us, I think, focus on in our research, of projects and output. Now, what he means by this is that input legitimacy comes through democratic engagement. So if you engage with people, you make a project legitimate. You consulted, you engaged, it happened. And most of our research is about that, I think. It's about how democracy works, how decisions are taken. But increasingly, governments don't increasingly will say that that even doesn't matter. They would argue that all that matters is that there is an output. In other words, if there's a new hospital, a new road, if there are new streetlights, the argument is made that nobody cares how you got them. All that they care about is that there's an output. And if there's an output, then the state is legitimate. Now, again, there's some argument for this. Some people would say, well, you cannot trust the state to run anything. And that's likely used as an argument to challenge the legitimacy of the state because it doesn't produce outputs. The private sector always delivers outputs. Otherwise, people go out of business. Therefore, it is output legitimate because it brings about outputs. Now, what a lot of governments increasingly in the 1990s and 2000s were arguing was that actually outputs were much more important than inputs. In other words, we focus too much on whether we ask people about things. All they care about is if the thing actually gets done. Is the new bridge built? Is the new road constructed? No one asks any questions about who does it, as long as it's done. Do you care if the hospital you run is owned by banks in China? If the hospital is new, you have access to it, and it is free. The state is paying for you to use it. That's the kind. It's a very strong logic to that argument, and one perhaps we want to engage with. But this has been used to justify a range of privatisation programmes and public-private partnerships. Because it's basically argued that if you get private companies to come in, not only do you bring in private resource, but you bring in private expertise. You take civil servants and public actors out, and you get better outputs. I think it's a hugely controversial argument, but it's one that's made loosely by people quite a lot in countries like Britain. It's made all the time, actually, as a way of attacking the state and what the state can do. Now, the UN and the World Bank are part of this because they have what's called a good governance agenda, which they basically push as a model for how government should work, how governance should operate. Do you want to go to the next slide? And it's this kind of integrated, holistic, consensus-based model of how governance should operate. And this follows absolutely an output-centred legitimacy argument. So the good governance agendas of the UN and the World Bank, this was taken from a UN document published about 3 years ago, argue that good governance is about consensus. It's not about conflict. That's old-fashioned. It's about class. We don't talk about class anymore because societies have moved on. So we focus on consensus. We focus on participation. We focus on following the rule of law, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, responsive, transparent, and accountable. Who could argue with these post-political constructs? They're very, very obviously. I mean, but of course, there are issues here about whether there are tensions between some of them. What if you follow the rule of law, but the law leads to more inequality, for example? No, that won't happen under a good governance system because these things will bounce off each other and lead to a virtuous cycle. This is the kind of language you get. But of course, clearly, as academics would say, well, there are clearly tensions between those things. But nonetheless, this has become very, very significant. And it underpins much of the discourse and logic, not only of these agendas in the UK, but actually much more broadly. You go to the global south. I went to India at a conference about this back in February. This was the kind of model everyone's talking about. Because it facilitates and moves towards a logic for more privatisation. Because private companies can come in, as long as they are accountable through contracts and accountable through public pressure, they will be responsive, they will generate more efficiency. They will bring things about. They will make things happen. And then the state will benefit by being seen to be more legitimate, and then everybody wins. Next slide. So the key arguments here are that I'm going to argue, though, in relation to my own research, thinking about some of these things, so that within changing urban politics, then, there's some quite significant things going on here. What we see is a number of things, all relating to some of these wider changes I've tried to outline. Firstly, we see what people like Braithwaite and others call the new public hybridities in the development, implementation and regulation of policy. And that's a bigger definition of privatisation than we often see. So we see new hybridities. I'm going to give you some examples. In the case of the British state, there are enormous numbers of secondments, people taken from private companies, working in key strategic areas of the public sector, delivering public projects. The question becomes, quite interestingly, who is public and who is private? It actually becomes impossible sometimes to determine these things. I did some research on the London Olympics, for example, and I was asking a few questions under freedom of information about the project. I wasn't allowed to see any of the commercially sensitive parts, in other words, any of the money being spent. We weren't allowed to know where the money was being spent, because as a public citizen, by knowing how the money was spent under the Olympics, you would undermine the ability of public organisations to negotiate good contracts. In other words, the more you know, the more you undermine your own political representatives. Those representatives, though, I found out, had contracted out all of their activities to a private company. So the private company, I wasn't allowed to know what they paid the private company because the private company was acting on my behalf under secrecy. A real hybridity. It's impossible to determine who was public and who was private. Literally, the private actors said they were public sector, because they were acting on my behalf to get a better deal or a better set of contracts around the Olympics. Secondly, there's what people like Alison Yateman have called a new contractualism in public policy. I find this writing, I mean, this is my own naivety, I think, but I find this writing extraordinary and fascinating, because basically, when you think about it, everything revolves around contracts. How many contracts are there in just setting up a room like this, in organising your lives and my life? How many contractual relationships are we involved with, whether it's to do with every time I buy a train ticket, it says on the back it's under a national contract, to having my work contract, to having contracts with the buildings. Think about the nexus of contracts in which we're embedded. And people like Yateman argue you can use this in public policy to think about how governments work. Can they work more effectively through contracts? Is there a new contractualism about how things operate that we can maybe make work better as well, actually more significantly? Alison Yateman's very positive in her writing. But it's interesting to look at that because increasingly, as we'll see in the case of London, understanding contracts is understanding public policy. And that's where people like me, maybe many of you as well, in terms of our research skills, have a real problem. Because I can't understand contracts. I'm not a contract lawyer. And yet increasingly, the contract is what shapes the public service. To understand the public service and to challenge the public service, you must understand how contracts work because of this wider privatisation. It's really hard to do that. There's a new plurality of actors, consultants, lawyers, advisors, who make huge amounts of money, staggering sums of money, out of all of this, and have a vested interest in making things even more complicated. There's an interesting example in Britain recently of, I read in The Economist, where, for example, there was a proposal from industry for every tree in a public space in Britain to be monitored every 2 years to see if it was dangerous. Who was pushing for that? It wasn't the public sector or society or communities, it was business interests who would then be given a contract to check every tree in public space in Britain for forever. And quite an interesting example then of how you maybe see a whole load of actors, because then the lawyers will be involved, the advisors will be involved in that. You would need tree surgery expertise to be brought in, and that also costs a lot of money. Interesting to think about how policy works in those respects. And some people would argue then there's a broader judicialisation also going on here. They're underpinning all of this is a judicialisation of public policy. Increasingly in countries like Britain, the only way to tackle inequality is to go to law, to go to court, to challenge through the courts what governments are doing on judicial grounds. And this is a part of a much wider trend going on. And part of the problem, of course, with that is that only groups who are well organised and can tackle judicial systems can take on projects through judicialisation. So whilst judicialisation looks like a good thing because law is open to all of us, of course the problem is it leads to quite a different politics. Increasingly community groups in London are finding every time they challenge something that we would traditionally think was a planning issue, they come up against contracts and law, rather than going to politicians. The politicians say nothing to do with us anymore, it's all about contracts, go and talk to your lawyer. Don't talk to the politician, talk to the lawyer, because the lawyer will sort it out. Right? So there's a real change going on. Of course, within that, there's a much bigger privatisation of state assets and under austerity, as I was saying. So moving on. Now, within some of this as well, then, I think one of the most interesting and perhaps under-discussed things over the last couple of decades, really, within research on kind of cities and changing governance, then, is the rise of different types of private elite. We think of business elites. I still think from that work of people like Clarence Stone and others in the 1980s. We think about business elites as being quite city-based, you know, in a particularly conservative way, I think, politically as well, and actually just getting on where they want governments to, yeah, give some assistance, but actually to leave them alone. They want a kind of neoliberalism, but maybe they want the state to help them out with certain things. It's all quite a cosy consensus, I think, in academic writing about what business interests are, and yet what we've seen is that there are, as I said earlier, these new business elites emerging who call for more regulation and more government, and I still think there's an intellectual challenge for us there to think about why that is. They demand also, though, and I think this is an absolutely fundamental point, they demand concessions. They want to be involved in how governments run services. As we'll see in a minute, companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers and others give government solutions and templates. But what these business interests want is to be insulated from the risk that democracy brings. In other words, governments change their mind. That's why they exist, because we have elections to change governments. But the thing is, if you are building a new hospital, it's a big investment. If you get a private company to build that, you've got to promise that private company for a long period of time that you will pay it back. Usually in the case that we'll see in Britain of 30 to 35, 40 years. In effect, you've suspended democracy for 40 years. You've said for 40 years, we'll write a contract with a private company, and then we will allow that private company to run and manage the hospital. And for 40 years, that company wants to be insulated from democratic risks. That means things like if there are new environmental regulations about buildings, they don't want to pay the cost of that, because why should they? They signed a contract in 2003 in good faith. In 2013, 10 years later, a new government comes in and says we want new environmental regulations on hospitals. Oh, well, hold on, we'd never signed that in 2003. You can't do it, sorry. Right, and this is the kind of new politics we're seeing, where governments are coming in, wanting to change things, but running into the buffers of long-term contracts that have been signed, because private companies say, we will only invest if there is certainty. The word certainty means the elimination of risk. The elimination of risk means the elimination, sometimes, of democratic accountability in politics. That's the danger, I would argue, and I can try and show why that matters in a minute. So we see here that companies seek to capture state contracts through privatisation, as I've already said, but it explains why state spending then continues to increase during a period of so-called neoliberalism. Right? State spending has increased in almost all, even in the US, but for various reasons there, I think. But state spending has gone up. There are companies that I just think that the big four companies then, the global business advisors, the companies that advise governments around the world how to govern, are totally under-researched, actually. One of them, Ernst & Young, I'd advise you to look at these companies' web pages. Of course, these companies, as I came on the train from Schiphol late at night to Utrecht the other night, I saw the PricewaterhouseCoopers building, I saw the Ernst & Young building. These are big corporate centres in every single key place they think that they can work with governments. Have a look at it. It's an incredibly confident web page. It tells governments how to do everything, from running nuclear power to running community engagement to running how you should think about regulating businesses. They're telling governments what to do. They're providing governments with templates, and they say, if you're interested in output governance, we give you a solution. Here it is. We know how to do it. We're the experts. Take away the other people, the local authorities, the planners, the planning process. Give us the power to do these things, and we'll do them. We'll deliver them. The next one. And similarly, PricewaterhouseCoopers, if we go on to the next one, KPMG, who I love their advertising slogan, which is actually very accurate. We cut through complexity. In other words, the more regulatory complexity there is, KPMG will give you a better solution. And so that might make you think, well, maybe it's in the interests of companies such as this to have more complexity. There is, in fact. So I think there's an interest in politics about these companies. And again, the level of engagement across different sectors, from housing to schooling and everything else in these documents is remarkable. What's the next one? Deloitte is the other four, or one of the big four, so-called. And they publish documents like the next one. This is a really important document about how governments in austerity can close the infrastructure gap. How do you do it? You do it by privatisation. In other words, privatisation is a way of boosting the amount of spending on projects. The counter-argument might be that the privatisation creates the gap. It actually makes projects more expensive and therefore you lose money. That's the argument that I've been looking at. But the way in which these documents are presented is, you've got a gap in public service provision. You can't afford it. Why don't you bring in private investors to help you, and we'll help you, and we'll help you build a new school, hospital, road, university, or whatever. And there are all kinds of organisations. So in Britain, there's an organisation, again, I've never seen any research on it, called the Public-Private Partnership Forum, made up of all of the big companies who are experts in privatisation and public, and it's incredible, 37, 38 companies, very powerful companies. And they lobby government at the highest levels. And there's a kind of discourse around this, which I think is fascinating. The kind of inevitability of change discourse that you see in these documents is something which is a role model in terms of how to make people think that things can only move one way. There's no alternative. PricewaterhouseCoopers in their documents will say things like, for those countries and cities and places like the Netherlands who have not yet received the benefits of PPPs, you are latecomers to the PPP party. But this can have its advantages provided the right lessons are learned from the trailblazers, they call the UK a trailblazer, who have moved to more advanced stages, a kind of developmental model, classic Rostow kind of fashion. The difficulties of procurement around these things when there is no political consensus surrounding the use of a PPP structure. The argument within these documents is that if politicians don't agree on these things, private companies won't invest because people might change their mind. It would be disastrous if you invested as a company in a hospital, but 3 years later a new government came in. So the argument in these documents is to governments and others to make sure that there is consensus, make sure there is no difference, iron out, eliminate political conflict, make a decision, give us certainty, we will come in and provide a better public service and welfare state. What's the next one? This is a great one. Organisations out there like the Complex Programme Group who pursue this at the highest international levels. I did a little bit of research for the book, because I won't go into in detail here, about how it is that organisations like the European Union make policy. I mean, they adopt, that's the word they use, they adopt a lot of policy from the private sector. They will bring together the experts in global accountancy, the experts in global law, get them together, they will come up with proposals, and the European Union then adopts them and rolls them out. And that's often how policy is made, rather than the more traditional ways in which we think it's made. And Complex Programme Group and others are really, really vociferous and very well organised and very persuasive, actually, in some of their arguments, in a more positive way, I think, about privatisation. Very interesting groups to look at, but they are hugely influential. You see some of the logos here of the companies, powerful companies push these sort of groups, and obviously. Just on to the next slide. What we then see, before I come to the detailed case for the last 10 minutes or so of London, is that the private sector has also been changing enormously. And we're kind of aware of some aspects of this, like a tip of the iceberg occasionally when we see things. But if you look at companies like Barclays, the British bank that's been around since the 18th century, in the last 20 years it has totally restructured many of its activities. Why has it restructured them? It's realised that the money to be made is in privatisation and infrastructure and welfare. So they now have huge, can you put to the next slide, please? They've split themselves up into all of these different subsections. If you look at the way these sort of organisations are organised, in order to try to bring their expertise, they say, and also bring finance to different types of public project. And they have systematically transformed how they work. And again, this has happened under the radar, I think, in many ways. You still think of a bank as a bank. But actually what we have is, Barclays, for example, now have a European Investment Fund Management Partnership, these are all listed on the London Stock Exchange, an Automator Management Partnership, an Infrastructure Investors Management Partnership, an Infrastructure Fund Management Limited Liability Partnership. There's a whole literature about that, and tax movements and so on. An Infrastructure Investors Fund Partnership. Remarkable how they change. And this has happened across the private sector, which is kind of almost chameleon-like, adapted to the new opportunities opening up through privatisation. There's been a real set of changes. What I want to do then for the last 10 minutes, you'd be glad to know, is move on to the British example, which is the trailblazer. Okay, and it is, as we'll see in a minute, for a lot of the new waves of privatisation that are happening and what they mean, I think, the implications of these things. I want to focus on the most significant, by far the most important, which is something called the Private Finance Initiative, which was launched from about the mid-1990s on, but it really took up a lot of take-up from the late 1990s into the 2000s. Now, under these private finance initiatives, with a new type of public-private partnership, private companies will come in. They're not just partners as in old-fashioned privatisation, where a company might run the local cleaning services or whatever. Here is completely different. Private companies are given a brief. It will be like build a new hospital. They will go away, design it, build it, most importantly finance it, as we'll see in a minute, and operate it. It's called a DFBO type of partnership. It is a model for the World Bank's good governance agenda, by the way. The World Bank have pushed this on people all over the world. So what happens is that when you look at this, I've been looking at some of these things, and there's some staggering figures. At the moment, under these projects, so many of these projects have gone ahead in the UK. The current liabilities, I've got up here £280 billion, about 330 billion euros of repayments to be made on these things. Actually, the figure's now higher. It's over £300 billion of repayments. In other words, these are huge, huge numbers of these things have been taken out to build almost every new hospital, road, school, and other building in the UK, really, over the last 10 years. All new infrastructure in Britain. Some of you at UCL a few months ago for the meeting, the fantastic new big hospital next to UCL is a PFI. It's not owned by the state, but it's paid for by the state under one of these. UCL has buildings on its campus built under these PFIs to be paid off. Well, actually, these things are quite interesting. They are basically mortgages. In other words, a private company comes in, builds it, the state pays nothing. Fantastic for a government. This is dangerous. The state pays nothing to start with, but then pays the private company back like a mortgage for a house under a long-term contract. This is very dangerous, because basically it says to current governments, you can have new infrastructure, private companies will build it, they will finance it even, they'll design it, they'll do everything, they'll build it, they'll give it to you, give you the keys. But you don't have to pay for it until the repayments start, because the private company has financed it. The private company, therefore, wants a return on the investment because private companies make money. So basically, you then have to pay back, like with a mortgage, over a period of time to that company to rent back the infrastructure. So in effect, they're not really owned by the state. They're actually rented back. Eventually, some of these will be then returned to the state, probably in very poor condition, because, of course, the private companies build them in a way that lasts for the period of their contract, 30-odd years, 35 years. And then the state will then take them back. That actually is interesting itself. There's a bit of shadowy research. I know people like Steve Musson at the University of Reading and elsewhere have been looking at some of those get-out clauses there. In some instances, it might be that the state has to pay for the infrastructure back, but that's not very clear at the moment. It's quite hard to know what's going on. It's another part of all of this. It's a model being copied across the EU. It's been rolled out everywhere. And if you look at the big companies pushing these things, they promote the EU credentials. Germany, Holland, France, and other countries are the new kind of gold rush, as they call it, in terms of opportunities here. Across Australasia and North America as well, where these big projects have been going ahead. The biggest one of all is in, I think, around Denver, and a new link to the airport and so on. On to the next one. I've done some work on mapping this across Britain. It's not quite so interesting here. There's a geography to some of this. The geography tends to relate, not so much to local political cultures. It tends to relate to how old the infrastructure was in different parts of the country. In other words, in London, there's a very, very high per capita PFI, but that's partly because the infrastructure was so old and needed replacing quite quickly. So what is the solution to that? Bring in these PFI projects to fund them. Can you just move on to the next one? The problems with this are lesion, I think, although there's some positives. You have new infrastructure. You have output legitimacy, of course, because it's there. No one cares. Do you care that for 30 years it's not owned by you? You're still using the hospital or the school or the road. But I think there are some problems here, because what we have is a replacing, literally, of democratic accountability, because you have a lockdown. What you have is a contract signed at a particular moment. Believe it or not, that contract will have to last 30 to 40 years. And at that point, every single possibility that will happen over the next 30 to 40 years has to be brought into the contract. So, for example, with hospitals, somebody in 2003, in the case of London's, South London's hospitals, signed a contract under these PFIs for 35, 40 years in some cases. They basically had to sit there and write out a contract that would cover every possible eventuality for what's going to happen to that hospital in 40 years. Every change in medical technology. Every change in patient demand, every change in population levels has to be planned in to the contract, because the building will not be changed once the contract is signed. Now, you start then thinking about strategic planning agendas, but how can you have a strategic planning agenda when your key infrastructure is locked into these things? There was a piece of research that came out on my local hospital, for example, that said that in 2003, nobody realised how many computers there would be in the hospital by 2010. So it's unbelievably hot in the summer, and some patients even fainted because there's not enough ventilation. the private company who owns it has no obligation to do anything about it. Because in 2003, you should have told us that by 2010 you'd need more ventilation. So why should we do anything about it? Because we don't have to under contract. It will cost us money. Sometimes the state, in that instance, will step in and pay lots of money to the private company to do a job for it. But it's a really interesting example of how you can't change some of this infrastructure. It gets locked down. What does that mean for democracy? What does it mean for strategic planning? These things are fundamentally important in Britain and totally under-discussed. Absolutely critical. Every time you do a piece of research on strategic or sustainable planning in London, you come up against these contracts. And no one's got a clue how to coordinate them, how to bring them back, how to change them, how to bring in different players. The public sector here basically now also lacks the skills, you might argue, to negotiate good contracts. One of the solutions to that, guess what, is to go and hire private experts to come and help you negotiate with other private experts, as we'll see in a minute. It's a wonderful form of regulatory capitalism in action. Companies like Innisfree, no one's ever heard, I never heard of them, even though I've been researching governance for 15 years, own huge parts of the British welfare state, billions and billions of pounds of assets. This is an American-based asset company, hedge fund, that specialises, as they say, in public-private partnership projects, not just in Britain, but also in Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, the USA, Canada, and so on. There's this new kind of global network of companies now. A company called Semperian. There's over 100 projects in the British welfare state, and they're hugely powerful. Yet we know nothing about what they think about sustainability, community engagement, or anything like that, because they're private companies. They don't have to engage necessarily with us. Let's move on to the next slide. So just to finish off, I'm going to give you two quick examples of what this means locally. What does it mean on the ground? It's quite an abstract discussion in some ways. It sounds like a rather dry discussion in some senses. But I want to talk about the meaning of this for people living in places. I want to focus firstly on social housing, which has been one of the... This is a list of all of the PFI projects signed, the repayments to be made on them for different sectors. Health is by far the biggest, and education. Interestingly, by the way, perhaps the most absurd example of a PFI came in Birmingham, in the West Midlands of England, where a school was built under a PFI, but the local population changed. There aren't enough children for the school. It's closed, but it will be paid for over 30 years anyway by the government, even though it's an empty building. That is the logic of this kind of privatisation. To reduce the risk for the private company, you basically said if the school takes no kids, we'll still pay for it anyway. There's remarkable absurdities in terms of waste of resources, and explaining why public sector spending keeps going up, of course. But anyway, housing's been a Cinderella issue, and it's an area of expansion, social housing projects, and it has become that. And if we move to the next slide, 22 projects in Britain now funded under these are worth about £1.15 billion. But actually, capital spending, but then there's a lot of repayments being made on the finance as well, huge amounts, probably about £3.7 billion to be made. And a repayment span locking down these projects for something like 40 years. The emergence of super companies is really interesting here. So super conglomerates have emerged to provide the state not only with the funding, the design, the building, but private companies in Britain now will even often do the community consultation for the state on behalf of, under a contract. So some of the people, I'm doing some work in South London at the moment on the South Bank, where private consultants are acting as state representatives and doing community engagement. Now, again, I think that's really, really significant because we still imagine that the public sector engages, the local authority engages. But increasingly, the local authority gives a contract to a company to engage on their behalf. Maybe that makes it more efficient, of course, or maybe it doesn't. But I think there's something quite significant about it. If we just move on then as well. Major firms then within this sector organise the cost and finance, community consultation, service provision. And I think this is really important, that citizens' experiences of the state actually are shaped increasingly through these private-public relationships, not by the normal old-fashioned relationships that we expect them to have, perhaps with politicians and others. And I've been doing some research on that and looking at what it means to be on the receiving end of privatisation, which I think is an under-researched area of citizenship studies. There's a whole load of other changes to the way in which these things are financed too, with new types of partnership and so on. And I want to focus, if we move to the next slide, on this part of South East London, doing some work in this area called Lewisham in South East London, an area of quite significant deprivation, an area that requires social housing investment. And I'm looking at some social housing investment projects there under these private finance initiatives. I've done this for a lot of projects in Britain, I've mapped all of the organisations involved in that private finance project. And again, this tells you why things are so expensive, why these companies make so much money. Because look at all the companies involved in the different aspects of developing just one social housing project. In the old days, a local authority would come up with a plan, go maybe to a developer, maybe, or maybe not, and get it done. Now, a plan has to be made, and then private companies have to advise on that. They have to come in, finance it, design it, build it, operate it. Everybody takes a chunk of the money. And it's incredible to look at this because you have, guess who's there? PricewaterhouseCoopers Financial were involved in advising the local authority on this. Right? We don't know how much they were paid, but they were given. Gardners and Theobald, another global multinational. So were Trollers and Hamlins, a legal firm. And then the big global insurance firm, Jardine Lloyd Thompson Risk Solutions Limited, were also involved. They all advised the local authority and made some money out of doing that. The private contractor is a new company called Building Best Value in Brockley, and they are made up of John Lang, we'll look at it in a minute, and Pinnacle, and I'll explain who these companies are in a moment. Then there are other contractors who build the stuff, Higgins Construction, who interestingly now gone out of business and become part of the Vinci Group, French group. Pinnacle again, Equipe, another French group. So there's a geography to this as well. We think about the local assets in South East London now being internationalised, globalised in terms of their ownership. And then you have other private companies advising the private companies on how to deal with the state. So you have Gleeds, Navigant Consulting, Denton, and Barclays Capital. One of those companies I mentioned earlier is the bondholder underpinning all of this investment. I think these kind of maps are really helpful. They give you a real insight into the new geographies emerging around public investment through privatisation. So who are these companies? You have Regenta, a regeneration company then set up to deliver this PPP, this public-private partnership there. Underpinning then is John Lang. John Lang are an interesting company because traditionally they were a construction firm. In fact, they were a charity organisation, sort of charitable trust. But in the last 10 years, they've totally changed what they do. They now specialise in public-private partnerships. They specialise in doing these welfare contracts because they've realised that that's where the good opportunities are. And I've been looking in detail at some of their accounts and how the money gets shifted around between different holdings and so on around private projects. We can go into that in a bit more detail in a minute. They themselves, though, have been bought out and owned by an enormous hedge fund based in the Channel Islands, or registered in the Channel Islands, for reasons that we can't possibly declare. We don't know, but we can guess maybe. And Henderson's Group plc, a huge Australian-based hedge fund, owns John Lang in relation to this, and actually underpin, really, they're the ones that shape what happens on the ground in Lewisham. There's a really interesting geography here going on. Pinnacle, the company, one of the other companies involved, is part of a bigger regeneration group, as we'll see. They provide all kinds of services. Have a look at these sort of web pages. They're a goldmine, actually. Have a look at the next slide as well. We get a sense that Pinnacle themselves are connected to Hong Kong-based companies and UK investments and Savills and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a network of global firms that see places like Lewisham as real opportunities. So what's a connection between someone living in Lewisham and these sort of come in Hong Kong? Well, here are the direct connections. It's a really quite an important geography emerging. Higgins, the construction company, then came in and built it. They then sold out to Vinci, the French company, who are becoming increasingly brilliant, and Veolia as well, the two French companies, capturing these contracts. That's another aspect of this, by the way, that companies that are really good at doing this get better, and they go out looking for more contracts around the world. You don't be surprised if you don't see British companies coming into the Netherlands and picking up welfare contracts all over the place in the next 10 years. Higgins are part of the Ryden Group, and the Ryden Group itself has it's part of the Ryhurst Limited chain. It is its own maintenance company, construction, homes, group, finance, community consultation, and everything else. A kind of super company that's emerged. And again, under the radar, I think, of many researchers, we don't really look at these sort of companies. We tend to still look at local government. But in the case of those social housing projects in Lewisham, local government is really no longer that important. It just pays the bills. It doesn't actually run or manage the projects. Right, final example, there's 3 slides left. I just wanted to touch on this. I mentioned a lot about hospitals in South London and in London. This is St Bartholomew's Hospital, one of the most famous hospitals in the world. It's a world-leading hospital in the city of London. It's been in the news recently because in 2006, it signed the PFI contract. It was, a big part of it was rebuilt under a private finance contract. I just wanted to show you this slide because I think if you look at its accounts, as I did manage to get hold of, I think it's really interesting, this, because in 2006, then the new hospital was built, given to the state for free. Then it was given to the state under a contract, and the contract required, like a mortgage, repayments up until 2049. That's a long time to think about all the issues a hospital faces. These repayments were then put in place, and every year it was decided in 2006, before the recession, that hospital spending will go up. Inflation might go up. Therefore, we must have increase repayments over time to make sure that the risk to the private company investors is not reduced. And so these are set in contractual stone and are almost impossible to break. I might come back to that in the end, actually, about breaking things. These repayments will happen whatever. Now, the problem is there's been a recession. Demand for hospital use has gone up in London enormously because the population in 10 years unexpectedly rose by 14% in London between 2001 and 2011. No one expected that in 2005. The problem then is that there are more demand and less money. But these are not going to change. The repayments are keep going up and up. And by 2047, £250 million a year will be given to the private investors. If there are big changes in inflation in that contract too, by the way, that will go up. So it's not stuck. If there's a hyperinflation, these will go hyper up as well. Now, how do you plan for hospital management in a context where you face these kinds of hammering repayments over time? And I think it's a really good visual example of the challenges that hospital managers and others in the public sector now face. They're not really dealing with the normal problems of politicians and others. They're dealing with this kind of structural problem in the public sector. So let me just conclude then. I think for 45 minutes, that's enough, I think. I think the paradox is that, of course, the good governance agenda and the way in which people tend to think and write quite often in the European Union and elsewhere is that there's too much government. There's too much bureaucracy. There's too much state. There's not enough governance. And I'm trying to argue in my research here and in the book that there's not enough government. There's too much governance. There's too much fragmentation. There are too many people involved. And we can talk a bit more in questions maybe about what that means democratically, I think. How do you plan for urban development in a context that I've just described? It's an obvious theme. State reforms, in this case, are increasingly justified through what Slavoj Žižek calls the politics of perpetual crisis. Because of crisis, we need more privatisation. Privatisation, some would argue, maybe helps to bring about crisis, but that's an argument perhaps we can have in a minute. I think for us as researchers as well, those of us that are researchers here, there are huge methodological questions. If you're trying to understand how anything works in this context, you must understand detail. For example, in some of the contracts I've looked at, I'm not a contractual expert by any means, okay, so I've looked at some contracts, and they say things like, there will be a no better, no worse outcome of any changes. That sounds like a very placid kind of term. What that means is that if governments ever change their mind, the investors cannot lose. They cannot reduce the income that they've been promised. Now, you might say that's fair enough, that's got a logic to it. But it does have big implications. You have to understand that as a researcher. When you're talking to community groups arguing for new hospital improvements, arguing for new public transport services, that is what matters. You have to understand why the private company or public operator does not do it. It was amazing. I looked at the contract to run those trains up and down my local train line in southeast London. It's a 303-page contract, and it's filled with amazing clauses. Things like, if there is a strike, it is possible that the public sector will give the train company back any money it loses. In other words, the company has no incentive to not have a strike because the government will repay it simply whatever it loses. That's in the contract. That's what matters in a way, rather than some of the bigger kind of strategic discourse analysis that we tend to do for projects. What is the state and what is it becoming then within this? And in many ways, this is the final point, governments increasingly are becoming contract managers. That they need contract expertise. They don't need the old-fashioned skills that we think our students need. Increasingly, they need skills to negotiate good contracts. And that's a real challenge for us. I think certainly in the Bartlett School of Planning, that's a major challenge. We still teach our students a lot of stuff about the planning system and so on, which is important. But increasingly, we need to make people understand what's happening here, I think. OK, any questions or comments?